On behalf of the Canadian Journalism Foundation, we're grateful for TD's support of this important and timely discussion on inclusivity in our newsrooms. The CJF's motto is, as journalism goes, so goes democracy. And now, more than ever, we need our newsrooms to deliver smart, thorough reporting on issues that impact Canadians. And our society and our democracy is best served by newsrooms that represent the country we cover. Marty Barron, editor of the Washington Post, said this so well in accepting the Hitchens Prize last November. It's a good time to talk about values. A lot could change in the coming year. But as journalists, we do what we always do, just do our job. And to do that job, we have to make sure newsrooms reflect the rest of the country and give those unheard voices a platform. It's important to stress the urgency of this. If we don't get this right, our journalism will become obsolete. Diversity is good for the news business, especially at a time when growing audience is critical to the future of any news organization. Your moderator for this evening has been a leader on reporting on Canadian identity and diversity. She's an award-winning journalist, and she's a quadruple talent. She's worked in TV, radio, broadcast, and as a producer. She began her career with Omni Television and became anchor of South Asian News. She's been a freelance anchor at CBC Radio. She's also produced 2 entertainment programs, and she writes her own column for Desi News magazine. She's currently working on a 2-year project with the South Asian Women's Centre titled There's No Honor in Violence Against Women and Girls. Please join me in welcoming the weekend anchor of Global News at 6, Angie Seth.
All right. Can everybody hear me? I guess that's a yes? Okay, good. Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Natalie. I mean, this is, as Natalie said, a really, really important topic. And the 4 individuals that are sitting next to me here are, I think I would say probably the right people to have up here to talk about this topic. Sitting right next to me, Desmond Cole, an award-winning freelance journalist and an activist based in Toronto. He's a columnist for the Toronto Star, and his work can be found in Toronto Life, Walrus Now, Toronto's Ethnic Isle, as well as several other publications. Desmond was honored 3 times at the 2015 National Magazine Awards, including a gold prize for Best New Magazine Writer. He also hosts a radio program every Sunday afternoon at 4 p.m. on News Talk 1010, and he's currently working on his first book about the experiences of Black Canadians. Welcome, Desmond.
Thank you very much.
Sitting next to Desmond, Sachi Kool is a senior writer for BuzzFeed Canada. Her work also appeared in Jezebel Flair, The Guardian, and The New Yorker. Her first book, One Day We'll Be Dead and None of This Will Matter, is forthcoming on March 7th of this year, 2017. So welcome. Sitting next to Sachi, Hannah Sung is a video and podcast producer at the Global Mail. She was the co-host and co-producer of Color Code, a podcast about race in Canada by the Global Mail, and was named a Best of 2016 podcast by Apple iTunes. Welcome. And finally, Aarti Patel is the living editor at the Huffington Post, Canada's Toronto office. She generally covers health, women's issues, food, relationships, trends, and coverage around diversity. In 2016, she launched Huffington Post Canada's Born and Raised series, a mix of features, videos, and personal stories of second-generation Canadians. Welcome, Aarti. Okay, so basically, we've got about an hour where these incredible individuals are going to be giving you their insights, and then afterwards we'll have about a half-hour Q&A. There's a mic in the back, and I'll sort of go over some of the instructions there. But for now, I'm going to throw it over to you guys. And the first, I sort of want to spring it off with talking specifically about what diversity means in the newsroom to you, and I'll have sort of any one of you kind of jump into it. As we were talking earlier and said, how do we research something like this? It's kind of what you do. So maybe Hannah, you're nodding there.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with the idea that diversity is something you do. It's a process. It's just the way you do the business of journalism, or it should be. And I'm so glad that when you asked the question, what does diversity mean? You didn't ask what does diversity look like, because I find that that's often the way the question is phrased.
Exactly.
Which is fine, because maybe that's a kind of shorthand, but it doesn't get to the real goal of what diversity and inclusion should be, which is that it's about representing many different types of ways of thinking and ways of living. So sometimes people see race or gender presentation as like shorthand for we're going to have all these different types of ways of thinking and living, which I think is maybe okay because it's a step towards thinking about what true inclusion means, because we're definitely not there. Like there are many steps that we need to take to get there. So true diversity would mean to me having many different types of people represented in the newsroom, because representation does matter. And it would be knowing who we are, because I find that Canadian newsrooms, we don't really look within and say, this is who we are, or this is who we're made up of, you know? It's kind of, there's a lot of vague talk about.
So do you think it's, you know, we've put a number of individuals of diverse backgrounds in our newsroom, and that's how we're representing diversity?
Yeah, well, even just the idea of, you know, I think the idea of checking a box to say how you identify racially or, you know, gender-wise or whatever it is, and then collecting that data is like just horrifying to Canadians, and like, okay, we could discuss that, you know, but there's something to be said for knowing who we are and how we do self-identify if you choose to the group, you know. An example of something I read recently, even though it's a few years old, I think, the New York Times public editor was apologizing or basically kind of trying to unpack this story that ran that was very offensive to some people. It was a story about Shonda Rhimes. I don't know if you remember this from a few years ago, but yeah, there was a big long profile on Shonda Rhimes, who was an amazing TV like writer and creator. And she was described right in the beginning as an angry black woman. And so the public editor got lots of angry mail. And in that column, she said, you know, we looked at ourselves and we have 20 culture critics at the New York Times, 2 of whom are people of color and none of whom are black. And so she was able to say that because she knows. But
right.
I don't know, did she have that information at her fingertips? I don't know that maybe Canadian newsrooms would have that information at their fingertips.
What do you guys think? I know you're nodding a lot, and you're dealing with both print and radio.
Yeah.
How are we reflecting that in those mediums?
Well, I think if we're going to be honest about the conversation when we talk about diversity, I don't know if I can use like an example, but who's seen Mad Men here? Okay, mostly everybody. So who thinks that the culture at work in Mad Men was because of a lack of diversity? It's kind of silly. It's a boys' club. It was intended to be a boys' club. If you see old pictures of journalists and all the white men wearing that same hat, it wasn't because people who fit that profile were the best journalists. It's because it was a boys' club. I imagine at one time this bank was a boys' club. Maybe it's still, I have no idea, but I bet you it was. I don't know about now, but everything has been a boys' club because that's the society and the world that we live in. So we're actually not talking about diversity to me so much as we're talking about dismantling the boys' club, desegregating the boys' club. We're talking about including voices that have not been allowed to be included up until this point. And I think we have to have a power analysis when we talk about that. Like I said, Mad Men didn't look like Mad Men because they just forgot to include everybody else. That was who they wanted to work around and have that social and work and professional environment around. That's who they wanted to do business with. It wasn't an accident.
Well, no,
And
you
so-
clearly saw it in terms of where women's place were within that environment, right? You're clearly saying that. So, Arthi and Sachi, how have things, I guess, been modified or changed or come out of that boys' club, to use, to jump off of what Desmond is saying? In your years as a journalist, then how has it changed, and how has it changed the way you've been able to report the stories that you report on, or at least as what we all do in the newsrooms is we pitch the stories to our producers, and we sell the idea as to why this is an important story to be told. So what do you guys think?
Yeah, I think for me, so I work in lifestyle. Lifestyle is mostly women. And that, I think, even has an impact on how the news that we do on a day-to-day is, like, forget different communities, but everything is from a woman's voice, right? And everything is written for this, type of woman who works a certain job and is getting married or has kids or whatever. So it's always been, I think, in lifestyle traditionally a very cookie cutter type of audience as well. And I know that also because I grew up reading lifestyle, but I never saw myself ever in anything, not when it came to celebrities, not when it came to pop culture, not when it came to relationships. So as a young journalist, when you go into a world like lifestyle, you either go in with two ways. Okay, I'm going to start writing about things that I know about, or I'm going to keep doing everything the same. And even today, like, I work in lifestyle and I write things that are very, very different, I find, but then I do end up writing things that has been sort of the cycle, like the lifestyle cycle. And we work in a calendar year where, it goes from Christmas to barbecue season to like back to school. And that's just the routine you follow. And I think as journalists, you almost become, you go into routine and you make yourself stick to the routine. And once in a while, you throw something that's different. But I think this time, especially in lifestyle, journalists have to think beyond that daily, diversity trend. And I hate that word trend because in the last couple of years, I think fashion publications, beauty publications are trying to be diverse, but because they think it's trendy. So they'll cover specific, outfits or hair. Bollywood. And suddenly it's like, this is so trendy and everyone's doing it. I'm like, we've been doing this forever, right? And and then you start seeing more of that and you see the pushback. And you see pushback from communities. You see pushback from Black women. You see pushback from South Asian communities. And I think like that turning point hasn't happened yet where people can read something on a mainstream website and go, okay, this is written for me. Like there's always kind of that other side backlash.
Sachi, your thoughts?
Oh, God.
I mean, and Sachi has written some very poignant articles. She doesn't keep her opinion to herself. That's
I've
for
been
sure,
trying. It doesn't take.
Which is
That's
what
the problem.
what I appreciate.
I don't know how much it's changed. I think for myself, I've probably fought to find room for myself in certain places, and that has sometimes been successful and sometimes it's not. I am in trouble constantly, so like it's not like it's effective. I think part of the conversation has shifted where before we were talking a lot about how to get women in the newsroom and diversity of gender, and now I think we're talking a little bit more about race, which is super important. The next conversation after that, which we are continuing to have the most basic of conversations when it comes to diversity still, and we have to keep having them, is talking about what kind of people of color we have in our newsrooms and how they're represented. So I'm thinking a lot now about, so when we have, you were talking about this too, like when we talk about Bollywood and stuff like that, or when we talk about Indian or South Asian women, do we show women who are fair-skinned? What kind of noses do they have? What kind of hair texture do they have? Like these are the other sorts of things that we need to start thinking about. I'm not sure, to go back to your original question, I'm not sure how much it's really changed. I think there are pockets that have changed, but ultimately when you look at who has power in these places, it's white dudes all the way, and not all of them are very receptive to talking or thinking about diversity or actually continuing to do the work beyond saying, well, you know what, I got a bunch of interns and they're brown, so.
So I'm going to throw out then maybe controversial question, I don't know. Do you feel you're typecasted based on your culture in a newsroom?
Yes.
Perhaps because you know well about that culture.
Yes.
Perhaps you can be the voice of that culture, and you can bring those stories to the newsroom, hence making the newsroom diverse in its content.
Sure.
I'm waiting for more. Elaborate on that. I mean, and I think our audience is going, some of them are probably going, oh, really? Today?
Well, I mean, it's easy.
Really? Sure it is.
Like it's easy, and I get that, but I mean, that's sort of the other thing about having more than one mission. You should have people covering their own communities. That's super important. I think we were talking about this earlier, but there was that story, I think it was in the Star, about Lee's ghee, which was one of the most frustrating pieces I've ever read because
Explain the story.
Yeah, it was about this. I think the journalist was a white woman, I believe, who wrote it, and it was about this white lady who went to India, found out how to make ghee, which is not that hard, by the way. It's like you just boil the butter. It's
now,
not hard.
but hold on, everybody, we're talking about homemade butter.
Yeah.
Right? Yes.
There
Okay. Yeah.
she is. She
now-
knows.
Yes. So Guy,
So she
Guy means
wrote this.
better.
She wrote this profile of this entrepreneur who made this thing, and this artisan, like kill me, like whatever. And it was so like she used pieces of sari to screw the caps on. Like it was just insult after insult. And the problem is if you don't have somebody who knows that community, someone's going to write that story, and that's a huge misstep. But at the same time, like I don't see a lot of women of color who get to be in the arts. I don't see a ton of them who get to work in lifestyle. I don't see a lot of them who get to work in business. They're put in places that we know they can do that work, but we don't think about what else they can do and what other perspectives they can bring to the other parts of their workplace.
What do you, Desmond?
I want to let Hannah get in.
Oh, well, okay. Okay, I agree with. I didn't read the Guy story. I
That's
wish that I had
okay.
seen it at the time.
Just be mad about it. That's all I
What
I think to
that's a tall
Sachi's
order.
point is that it is an article about something that, quote, might be trendy and
yeah.
treaded on every stereotypical thing
Yeah.
of
And
trying
also-
to make it cool and trendy.
And I can understand the kind of breathless, like, I just discovered this thing. Maybe if that is annoying to people, I could totally understand that. I would just like to say the flip side, though, is that not everybody who's in a newsroom that is mostly white wants to be called upon to speak for their people.
Yeah.
And in fact, you know, I don't feel that I could, and that hasn't really happened to me. Like one time, I was asked if I could go report at a Korean language church, and I said I'm not capable of doing that, but you know, because the story was kind of North Korea related, I was like, but I know some people, I just happen to know them, let me connect you. And I think I did find a proper translator. I don't mind being asked those things. I don't, but that's just me. I can see how somebody might mind, and also I'm comfortable saying that I'm not capable of translating, or that I don't even go to church, which is crazy for a Korean because most Koreans do. You know, so. I just hope that there is an understanding that while it is really important that, you know, people can report on their own communities, that just because you look a certain way doesn't mean you have varying levels of closeness to what is a community even, you know? Like, why do I have to be racially identified as being part of a community? Like, do you want to call me, like, I would say my community is probably like, a mom of young children who's a little bit obsessed with like trying to make like the family work thing happen. Like that's probably my community, you know. So yeah, just representation is important, but representing is hard on the individual.
Yeah.
And I think too, it's important what Hannah's bringing up, that this is complex because we don't want to be tokenized.
Absolutely.
We don't want to
No.
be brought into these positions so that somebody can check a box,
Yeah.
or so that somebody can come to us and say, you know. So I remember one time I was writing for a really small online publication, and it was the World Cup. So the World Cup's happening, and somebody got a really good idea. It was like it was when I was working for Torontoist, and we do a lot of these little posts about what's happening around town. So the idea was there's going to be different bars playing the different games and championing certain countries and making sure, hey, if you want to watch Italy, come to this bar and watch all the games. So why don't we do a rundown for all of our readers? Well, this was when the World Cup was in South Africa. It's the first time the World Cup has been on African soil, and there's 6 African nations competing. I just waited because I already knew it was going to happen. But nobody took any of the African countries to figure out what bars would be showing their games. Everybody wanted to do Italy and Portugal and Netherlands. But it was just left. So I said, fine, I'll do them all. And I didn't want to.
Yeah.
But no one else was interested.
Yeah.
And sometimes we have this conflict of like, should I be taking this on? You know, I don't want to be that guy. But then the other thing too is the way that our voices and our identities can be misused, can be used to say something that might be as hurtful to us. To give you an example, I'll never forget this one. Toronto Star, after Chris Spence, the former head of the Toronto District School Board, admitted to plagiarism, and he resigned from his position. Now, Chris Spence is black. Chris Spence was the first, I think, black director ever of the Toronto District School Board. The Toronto Star featured a piece by a fellow named Desmond Brown, Desmond Brown wrote that Chris Spence had disgraced his students and set a horrible example for them by plagiarizing. Okay, sure. He then went on to say that Chris Spence owed a separate apology to black people for failing them so badly. If a white writer had written that piece, would it have gotten in the Toronto Star saying Chris Spence needs to apologize specifically to black people? Nope. Would the headline that they used have been used? And I've seen that before too. The black writer writes the piece, and then the white editor writes the headline. And it sticks it on there and says, that's this person's opinion. Look, that's racism and that's tokenism as well. And using somebody who you're letting write for your publication and saying, look at all this diversity, but allowing them to say something that is harmful to that community. And I think that we can't fall into these really easy, I get this all the time in covering policing. Oh, but Desmond, you're criticizing Mark Saunders about race issues. He's black. Yeah? As if we don't have different perspectives within our communities, right? As if we're not complicated. We are complicated, and I think that beyond ticking the box, there has to be some complexity in who what the political ideologies are, if it's in a newsroom, of a comment section, of what perspectives people are bringing if they're in entertainment or sports or whatever. It can't just be got the brown person, got the disabled person, got the queer person. We have to mean more than that in the newsroom.
Well, also we are journalists, and as journalists, we're going to want to tackle any type of story that we feel passionate about, that we want to report on, and report on it in a proper, well-balanced manner. I mean, our jobs are not to give you the opinion. Our job is to give you the information, and you develop the opinion based on all of the information that we've given you. But also what's interesting from what you guys have also said, just because someone looks a particular way doesn't make them an expert in that community. I have a number of friends who are South Asian, but they've been born and raised in Canada. They don't speak the language. They don't eat the food. They don't wear the clothing. They don't, they don't celebrate Diwali and whatnot. Yet they have a darker skin and are automatically sort of slotted into a category. And you're going, yeah, but my parents we didn't really learn. We came and we're here, and I'm Canadian, eh? I mean, that's really what it is. And so, based on what you were all saying, and I'm hearing definitely that level of frustration and that concern. Does there need to be? And I know you're going to sort of go, oh God, she's asking this question. Diversity education in the newsroom. Does there need to be diversity education in the newsroom then? So that there is that understanding, that there is that knowledge that when our journalists do go out to cover stories of a diverse nature or regarding a particular cultural background, there is that knowledge and understanding and sensitivity, but also the point of telling the story.
Well, I would say yes, but I would say, working in a newsroom, there should be all types of education, and it doesn't really happen because people are very busy, people are overworked, people are wearing so many more hats than they used to, and they're just like, you're just trying to get through your day, right? And you're trying to do your work to the best of your ability. So educationally speaking, there isn't a lot of room for just doing that kind of development, newsroom development, but I do think that race in particular is a unique type of topic. So it would be great in a perfect world to have all kinds of education around that. I will say though that it really seems like people learn from each other's work. You're watching what other people do, and you're learning from talking to them on their off hours, about the process of what they did. And so, for example, when I worked on a podcast that was all about talking about race, and we had a small team of people, but I enjoyed so much that we were interdepartmental, and so we could talk about all the different aspects, and then we could go off into our corners of the newsroom and talk to our, friends and colleagues about it. And I found that people were really curious. So what I found interesting was who was curious about the work that I was doing, and the people who would chat with me about it. And now the Globe and Mail has a new race beat, or race and ethnicity focused beat that's about to happen. So it's not like the topic of race and ethnicity, diversity, and all those things, and identity, it's not like those topics were not covered previously in the Globe, but it's really gratifying to have a new beat be announced, because it shows that on a management level, there's the idea that this is something that's important for Canadians to read about, that we need to, divert precious resources and people power into, being dedicated on that topic. I don't know if those things are linked, but I just think that it's important for us all to be learning from each other. And so there's like some onus of responsibility on each one of us, not just people of color, but like every single person in the newsroom, to be self-educating and teaching each other just through our work.
And I think it also has to start from the top. Because when we hear about diversity education, it's always this idea that we'll go into a room at lunch for an hour, and then a journalist will come in and talk about their community, and then you'll go back and you'll have all these ideas of, and then that again goes back to this idea that this one person cannot represent being a South Asian person or a Black person. But I also think race and these topics are uncomfortable to talk about for a lot of people. They don't want to ask questions, or they think they're going to offend someone, or they think they might be racist even asking a question. And I don't know what the solution to that is, but I know that is an issue sometimes that we even face when we're writing stories and we're not familiar with the community. It's like, okay, we're gonna have to Google this, we're gonna have to make sure we're using the right words. Like, let's email someone that we know is from this community and see if we're not, because the last thing any of us want to do is offend, a reader or offend a community. But it has to be top level. Like, it has to be part of these best practices and these, these books that all these newsrooms keep. When we were in school, when we were at Ryerson, like they drill like CP style into you, and then you do like 1 semester course of diversity. And why am I learning so much about grammar and all these other things when I'm going to be working for the rest of my life and I'm not familiar with how to actually cover diverse stories?
No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, I also think too that in my ongoing desire to talk about power structures and how they affect this conversation, we have to distinguish between talking about diversity and talking about, for example, anti-oppression and anti-racism. Because these are not the same thing. Diversity training, I don't know what diversity training actually means. I don't know what it means, because diversity is not, you might think of it as some ideal that we're trying to achieve, but you can't break that down for me into a series of steps. I want to talk about anti-racism and anti-oppression, because in a newsroom, for example, I know that people's ideas are going to be rated and judged oftentimes by who they are in that newsroom. And that has to do with gender. It's not just race that I'm talking about. That has to do with sexual orientation. It has to do with ability or disability. It has to do with a lot of different factors. So you can't just, for example, say, well, we've got people with disabilities in our newsroom, we've got people of different races, so we have diversity. How are those people now experiencing your environment at work when they're there? That's about anti-oppression, anti-racism training. That's about recognizing power imbalances. And when we work as journalists, when we write stories, those power imbalances, can I give an example again? And I talk a lot about The Star because I'm a columnist these days at The Star. I consume more of that newspaper than any other and have for most of my reading years. So I'm not trying to pick on them or favor them or anything like that.
Go for it.
Public editor's right over there
Yeah,
too, so I gotta
that's
be
what I'm saying.
careful.
Go for it.
No, I remember recently we were talking a lot about Nancy LG. Nancy LG, if you didn't hear the story, used to be a school board trustee in York Region. In November of last year at a board meeting, Nancy LG referred to a Black parent who was in the room at the time as the N-word. In plain, other people were standing around and heard this and were shocked. And then after this was reported, Nancy LG refused to resign. She actually didn't resign until last Friday. So it took about 3 months for this to all play out. At one point, and the public editor has actually written about this, Kathy's right here. At one point, our publication let Nancy LG's children write an opinion piece defending their mom. Now, I have to tell you that I think that's ludicrous, because I don't think as her children they have anything to add to the discussion. They were not there. And we know that they support their mom. I'm not begrudging them for that. But they don't have anything of news, I don't think, value to add to that whole situation. But not only were they allowed to write their opinion, it was framed as, know the facts before you judge our mother. But the Toronto Star's reporters for weeks had been uncovering the actual facts of her saying this word, of her denying that she said this word, and of the board trying to cover up for her. So now you have a newspaper that did all that work, letting somebody else write a piece saying, but you don't know all the facts. They also allowed these two kids to sign their names at the bottom of the piece with their academic credentials. They're both professors. What do your academic credentials have to do with being like, I like my mom, I think you should give her a chance? But that was allowed to be put in the newspaper. And don't think, guys, that I take it for granted in all of this, that they were arguing with a black woman who they called the N-word. That mattered to me. I see that power imbalance. And what I see is a lot of people getting uncomfortable and being like, well, she's a well-respected woman. Her husband was a cabinet minister in Bill Davis's cabinet. Her children are educated and have master's degrees and teach. Maybe they're intelligent and know something that we don't know. That's that power imbalance being reflected in how the story is being covered. That's part of the conversation also. And we see now how that goes much deeper than who gets to write or what background that they have or how much diversity training you got that week in the newsroom.
I was thinking about what you were saying about how you learn a lot about the world from the people that you work with. So when it comes to sort of this training question, a lot of it is sort of just talking to people and meeting people. One of the complexities of this is that I don't think it's the responsibility of people in a marginalized group to teach the majority how to behave. I already have a job. It is also not my job to tell you not to be an asshole. If you can't figure that out on your own, I'm not sure how much you're going to learn from me telling you to not act like that or not say things like that. So I don't have I'm more of like a problem finder. I don't really find solutions, but like one of the issues is that you can't go into a newsroom and say like, well, you know, he'll do it. He'll do it for everybody there because they've got like, they don't have anything else. That's not a good enough answer. So it's great to like talk to your colleagues, and I think like, yeah, it's good. You should listen to what they say, and this is why you should have, you know, diverse. I'm starting to really hate this word, but we don't have anything better. I know that. Why we have diverse newsrooms and why we. That's way worse. It's way worse. But that's why we have that. But it's still not the responsibility of those people to take that mantle. It's not my job.
Yeah, but I think that reading each other's work, listening to each other's work,
And that's part
Yeah.
of education. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I have
Of-
learned
as a journalist.
so much from reading and listening to and consuming the work of other people in my own time. And I hope we're doing that.
But I would also say that like for some people that works and they absorb that and they learn new things and they're receptive to it. But if that were the solution, we would not be talking about this
absolutely.
because it would have been fixed. Because lots of people read my work, they have tons to say about it. It's often negative. But if that solved the problem, this panel would be obsolete.
true.
But things don't just pop up like that without trying. This is the same question we have about should we keep track of who we hire and where those people are. Well, we kind of have to, because when we don't, nothing happens anyway. So at least let's like make an effort to see who we're hiring, how we're hiring them, where we put them, and what they end up working on.
So can we not say, if we don't want to use that word diversity, is diversity not mainstream? Is not diversity a definition of
just don't know
who
what
we
it
are
means
as Canadians? Even if I'm looking at this audience right here, I'm seeing a mainstream audience. I'm not seeing, you know, here's mainstream over here, and then the other guys over there are the diverse audience because they're of different backgrounds.
I think that the term diversity actually doesn't have any real meaning. That's what I was trying to say before. We can all live within proximity to each other in the same square acreage and kilometerage of the same city. It doesn't mean we're talking. It doesn't mean we're listening. It doesn't mean that we have shed all of the prejudices that come. Like, actually, I sometimes think of Toronto as being an extremely segregated city, and I'm not saying that to be provocative. Why do all of the Somali people live in Rexdale? Not all of them, obviously. But why do, like so many East Asian people live in Agincourt? Like, people are supposed to be free to go everywhere they want, but we actually see through a lot of historical patterns of where people settled when they got here that we have these spaces.
Niches, and I think that's because of the sense of community. When you come here, you want to gravitate to someone that you can relate to, that you can feel a connection with, and and then eventually things will sort of spread out as you.
But so all we're talking about when we talk about diversity to me is bodies being in proximity to each other. And that's not a really big accomplishment. I actually want to talk about equity. I want to talk about a newsroom where people who have been historically underrepresented get their voice in the newsroom, get to be promoted in the newsroom, and promoted in their different section that they're working in. I want to talk about people really having that equity of outcome and of opportunity, rather than just bodies being close to one another.
So then let's talk about that. How have we, or how has there been situations of equity? How has the knowledge that you guys have, or the stories that you want to cover, or the ideas that you've been able to put out there, talk to the news director, the producer, the editor, what have you, and say, here's an issue that I think is important, to everyone, and I have a sense of knowledge and understanding of this, and it may be specific to a community, but it's something that can be of interest to everyone, not just something that's community-based. And now we are breaking that, quote, ceiling, mold, and whatnot, and say, here are issues that are important to Canadians, not South Asian Canadians or Black Canadians or Asian Canadians, et cetera. Can you give me some examples where we've actually been able to do that, and we are now seeing perhaps more of that, or that's becoming leading more towards the norm? I have a silent panel.
I mean, I technically work for the U.S. arm, in a way, where I work. So my editor is American, and our team is American.
Okay.
And I have a super diverse team. So I don't feel it as much. But again, that's because I work for an American company. I don't know how that would look if I worked for one of the, the big three here. I think it looks very different. The Canadian side of BuzzFeed is also, we've allowed one white man to work for us. That's the cap. That's all we've said. He's also the boss, so he's doing fine.
The boss.
Yeah, we let him in. But I work in what I guess is called new media, so we are thinking about it maybe a little bit differently. We don't have the structures that have been there, for that long as with other publications. So we've got different things to deal with, but yeah, I don't know.
It might also be generational.
Yeah.
When you mentioned that you're working in new media, which I thought was a term that went away with the 90s, but
what else
it's
do
okay.
you call it?
I don't
Internet
know,
machine,
the internet, yeah.
meme maker.
What is new media? No, I'm just,
I can't do that today.
But really, generationally speaking, maybe, everybody talks about how the population will be more diverse in the future in Canada, and that's just true. And it's just true that 40 years ago, Canada was whiter, and it was, before multiculturalism became a policy, people in the government said this is a white man's country. And I mean, you can see that in the policies that were developed and that still, hold true to this day. So I guess my point is that it's difficult to roll with change and to shape change. Change is just happening, right? Mm-hmm. And so I kind of feel like the work that all of us do on a daily basis is an uphill battle. It always feels that way. You're it's work. That's what it is, right? But all of us have a duty to apply a race lens, because you can't, why would you take that away? That's the way that many of us just live our lives and see and do and be. And I think that kind of gets to the heart of why the word diversity isn't quite enough, is because the word diversity, it's like a thing. It's not an action, right?
It's an idea.
Yeah, it's an idea. And it's so what happens when you get 10 bodies in a room and they're all in close proximity and you've got diversity? Oh, you've achieved diversity, and now what? What are you doing? Mm-hmm. So it's funny because at the Globe, I was part of a diversity committee. We called it the diversity committee. Yeah, well, it's just funny because we formed this diversity committee to try and meet and read and learn and then make recommendations to the company. But halfway through in all our reading, we were like, what's the word diversity? Why did we call ourselves the diversity committee? It's like we were at a very kind of basic stage at the beginning, and we didn't even realize how little we knew until we got into it. And there's a whole diversity and inclusion engine that's going, right? And all kinds of like in journalism and in the corporate world and all of that. And there's all the language out there. And I think halfway through the process, I definitely realized that the word diversity has so much baggage. And I don't know if that's because the word isn't doing it, or if because any word that has to take on all of that heavy lifting is just going to accrue baggage along the way. Then you have to like discard it and start with a new word, like kind of fresh. I don't know. But like just to wrap up what I was saying about the diversity committee, since I brought it up, we did make recommendations to the company, and they were wholeheartedly embraced. It was very much like I remember being in a meeting where there was a PowerPoint, and we went through the recommendations, and David Walmsley, the editor-in-chief, said at the end, "Yep, like, that was it. Let's do it. Let's do it now," right? So that's great because the attitude is like, yes, we want change, but then that's when the work begins, right? So we've been meeting for months talking about what are we going to do, and now we have these recommendations, and now it's like, oh my God, it's really hard to create change, right? So a bunch of those things did come to pass, but it's a process, like I was saying. It never ends. You never get to that perfect place because people working together on this shared project, it's like going to be messy because we're all just people. But at least we could do it to the best of our ability, and doing it with a diversity or race lens is like adding that layer to make it to the best of our ability, right? But
What about the rest of you?
Yeah, it's work. It's a lot of work. It's
Yeah.
one thing to say that, we want our content to be more diverse, that we want our content to be more inclusive, but to actually do the work is a lot of work. Like I work in lifestyle where one of my biggest struggles of the day is finding pictures of stock images of people of color. And my editor's sitting here right now, and I always yell at her, I'm like, why is the Indian woman always wearing Indian clothes? Like I can't find just a person who looks like me doing like a regular thing like sleeping,
also,
right?
stock hands are always white. Stock hands.
And that's so small, but that's something that I have to do every single day that's going to affect the type of work I do, the content that I write, and the type of stories I do. Like if I can't find, and we also work in this cycle that's 24 hours, and it's competitive, and everybody wants to be first. So sometimes you don't want to put the extra legwork and go find a source who is of color.
And your editor didn't hear that, by the way.
No, no, like you don't want to do these extra things because you work on such a strict schedule.
Yeah.
But like going back to that other question about talking about these topics and bringing it to newsroom, I've been grateful enough to work in a newsroom that basically lets me write about whatever I want. But it wasn't always like that. Like I remember when I was at the Globe when I was younger, I was an intern. Like I pitched all kinds of stories, and some were South Asian, some were student-based, and they all got rejected. This is not something that Canadians can relate to. This is not something that a big community can relate to. And I think that is also a problem. Because when you're talking to younger journalists and you're being rejected of stories that you think are unique or different, that already creates this mentality that, you shouldn't write about the things that you know about. So I took all those ideas and I pitched one when I went to the HuffPost right away. And it was one of the first big features I got to write. And just because it wasn't newsy to, a mainstream audience, it was still a story that was not covered. It was about skin bleaching.
Which is a huge,
Which was like
huge
6 years ago,
story.
I wrote a story about this guy in Toronto who was skin bleaching because he tried to get into acting and he couldn't get a job unless he thought he was lighter skin.
Right.
So I pitched it when I was a student and got rejected. So then I went to HuffPost and it was one of my first pitches, and then they picked it up. And at that point, it's like, okay, you're working for a giant brand that is going to write about something like this. Like that's huge, and that has a ripple effect to everyone who's reading. And that's happened to me so many times when I write about specific things that are South Asian. Like I have random people who message me like, "This is really weird. It's weird to see you write about things like ghee or Gerba or things on this website."
But does it resonate in the newsroom? Like, do you find that that you are getting that positive vibe, if you will, or it's this is important stuff that we need to be
For sure.
writing about, et cetera, because these are important issues, they're important topics, what have you.
Like I think for us at HuffPost, it's very, trial and error, and it's a newsroom that lets you, again, if you think it's important, like they trust your judgment, right? So I've been lucky enough to, like when I launched Born and Raised, it was, this is a very basic storyline. It's about being a child of an immigrant, and write about whatever you want. And out of that came so many interesting stories that, like, from communities that I didn't even know about.
Yeah.
So I think you really has to be the editor's job, and I'm talking like senior editor and management level, to really let these, if you want these voices in your newsroom, like let them experiment, and if it doesn't work, okay, but let them write about these things that they want to write about.
We are using the term newsroom a lot. I'm using it too. And it occurs to me that the Toronto Star building is down the street here at 1 Yonge, and I am almost never in it. Because I freelance, I'm not on staff, I write in my underwear at home most times.
Virtual newsroom.
Virtual. But the reason I think that that's actually important is because the newsroom, the actual news, the physical newsroom at the Toronto Star where people have reasonably stable employment, does not look the way that it should, even from a really superficial A1 diversity perspective. A lot of people who are getting hired into new jobs in media are getting hired on a part-time basis, are getting hired on a freelance basis if they are at all, are getting pitch by pitch. And it's real hard to talk about this conversation when we're shedding so many jobs in general in our industry. And the newsrooms always kind of have not been where the rest of the population is in terms of representation, and now the jobs are being cut, right? So if you are getting an opportunity now, is it like the opportunity that people were getting often 20, 30 years ago? Maybe not. The other thing I want to say to answer your question about like what can it look like when it's working, I think a great example is the Star's Known to Police series about police carding in the city of Toronto. And I think people need to understand that that series, Known to Police, which I think came out 2012, 2013, is part of a longer, like years-long investigation and series of freedom of information work and investigative reporting that reporters at the Star did to understand who Toronto police were stopping, how frequently, and why, and understanding concerns from people in community, but primarily, overwhelmingly, black people who were saying, I'm being stopped for no reason by the police. I'm being harassed by the police. Now, that story has national import because the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 9, says that that can't happen. Section 9 says that you and me and everybody in this room has the right not to be arbitrarily detained by our police. But that happens to black people every single day, even now.
So in terms of how the Star handled this, is this the example where you said, okay, we've made headway in terms of how they focused it, how they researched it, and how they presented this issue, rightfully so, to the audience?
I give Jim Rankin and Patty Winsa and others, I don't think that any of the main reporters who worked on that were black, too. That's the interesting thing, is I think that I wanted to bring that example up because they showed a curiosity for what was happening in our community, a deep curiosity and concern. That if what was being said was true and could be backed up with numbers. Now look, you don't have to ask us for numbers in our community. We know, we live it every day. But the media does a different thing. We go and get the numbers. The fact that they cared enough to do that and to put the stories of black people at the front and can continue to do that over years, even though it costs a lot of money and stuff, that's what equitable journalism can look like. Because in the end, making sure that civilians are not stopped arbitrarily benefits the whole society. But if it's happening disproportionately to one group of people, you have to make that your story, and they did. And I think that's a great example of how that can work.
Anything to add, Sachi? No. I mean, obviously, and I have one more question in terms of when we're looking at now who the audience is, who the reader is, who the listener is, who the viewer is. I mean, that's one thing that we're constantly doing at Global, to say who is that audience and what are the stories that they are looking for. Our producers then turn to us and say, what are the stories that you think our audience is looking for? The audience is ever changing. The audience is, to use the word, more diverse in many aspects, from what their interests are, what they think is news, issues that now might be important to them that perhaps weren't important to them, a year or so ago. And that's sort of one thing that we pride ourselves on Global, to make sure that we are, just like the Star did, we're doing the research and we're finding out what stories are out there that we need to be talking about, whether it's something very, very newsy or whether it's something that's close to the heart. So how are we engaging and listening to that need? And then as journalists saying, what do we need to do to answer that need in terms of what we're seeing and what we're gauging from our audiences? And that sort of bringing back in, whether it's a virtual newsroom or an actual newsroom or not, bringing that, I guess, diversity of information, or that need for other stuff to be covered, issues, whether it is karting or whether it's ghee or whatnot, that you're hearing them say, I want more information about that. And you guys are saying, guys, this is information that we need to give them.
So I will say here that the biggest problem I see with the perceptions of the audience on the part of producers, on the part of news directors and all that kind of stuff, is that I write a lot about racism, anti-Black racism specifically, and I have not encountered very many of my bosses who they mostly seem to have this opinion that people maybe want to hear about that sometimes, but geez, Desmond, you talk about this stuff all the time. You can write about sports 3 times a week and guys shooting a puck into a net 3 times a week for the publication. But if you want to write once a week about race issues, and I don't even write about race once every week, you will be told that you're focusing on this too much and that your audience needs you to be more diverse in what you're creating. I have been told this so many times, but I'm so spectacular at what I do, and I am not. First of all,
Not modest at all.
no, I'm tired of having to downplay the fact that I'm good at this. I'm an expert, and I want that expertise to be recognized for something. I want it to be valued. But I write about lots of things. I write about Canadian politics. I write about provincial politics. I followed the city beat for 3 years. I'm an award-winning journalist outside of my race stuff. So what I see as being a problem a lot of the time is that the bias of my bosses is that they are imagining an audience out there that doesn't want to hear this stuff or will get tired of it or will just get turned off. I have built a very large audience by talking about this stuff as much as I do. And so it's weird that here I am out here building a really massive audience in my social media and in my following. And it's very clear to everybody that I'm doing that. But that somehow my editors can be telling me at the same time, well, people don't necessarily want to hear a lot of this. Why are they following me? Are they following you if they're not following me? I think I've brought a lot of people to the publications that I work for and to the broadcasters that I work for that weren't there before I started creating content for them. So do you want your audience, which is white and older, skewing in Canada, or do you want mine? Is it about the audience, or is it about you not recognizing my audience?
What are your thoughts, ladies?
I think that is obviously a very solid point. And the other side of this is something that we struggle sometimes with too, is do you write stories to educate an audience, or do you write the story for the audience? So in lifestyle, I write about food. Am I going to have to put in brackets what something means, or define it, or define the term, or do I just straight up write it for a South Asian reader? And that's something that we struggle with all the time, because our main audience is white, it's older. Sometimes they might not understand what the language is, but at some points I'm like, I don't want to have to explain this every time, because if I was a South Asian person and I was reading a story about ghee, I know exactly what you're talking about, and I want to read it. Lee, yeah, it's artisanal.
He's wonderful.
But I wrote a story a couple years ago about this a fashion story about this Bollywood actress and her beautiful wedding outfit. And it was very cheeky, and I just wrote this headline like, it's gonna make all brown girls drool. And I got all these hater comments from people. And my editor, before they published, they're like, are you sure we should write brown people? I'm like, yeah, because a brown girl looking at that would be like, holy shit, I can wear this outfit. Anyone else would be like, oh, this is nice, right? So I wrote it in that sense. And I just straight up, I didn't explain what anything meant. I didn't talk about the functions and the ceremonies and religions. I just wrote it. And I had all these commenters just like bash me, call me racist, like you would never say this about a white person. I'm like, have you seen the wedding industry? Like everything that I hear about weddings is a white dress.
Yeah.
So the one day that I write about something that's not a white dress, I am called a racist. But again, that's just simple. Like, do I write something for the audience, or do I write something to find a new audience? And that's something that I struggle with every day still. You know, when I write about, especially the South Asian community, I want to write for South Asian people. I want people to relate to this and say, yeah, girl, like this is exactly what I'm going through.
Right.
Not for someone else who's not in this community to come later and be like, well, I don't understand this. Stop complaining. So it's an ongoing struggle. And that's
Hannah?
never going to go away.
What you
Hannah,
mentioned
Sachi?
about the comments, I mean, that can just maybe be like troll culture, but it also, to me, kind of, there's a link with what you were saying about a hockey writer can write about like pucks in a net 3 times a week, but you talk about race too much. I read a study recently that said that if you talk about race or diversity or inclusion in the workplace too much, there's like a social penalty. There can be for pretty much anybody, any way that you identify, except for white men. There's no kind of social penalty that can be like, you know, measurable on a white man who talks about diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So there is kind of this thing that you take on when you decide to talk about race, and that I think is something that we all understand. And it also gets to the point of white allyship, which may be fraught as an idea for some, but I just feel like it's so important because, you know, it's not just about educating people, it's about people wanting to learn. You know, you can't force someone to learn, especially a grown-up. I'm not going to force like my peer to learn or to listen or to seek out information on their own. There has to be that desire, right? So I'm interested in thinking about like how to cultivate that desire, or how to cultivate the courage to be an ally, what it even means. And, you know, because if we are talking about places and power where people in power identify a certain way, well, I just want to be sure that all those people are interested in the multitudes of issues that, like, you know, there's so many things out there that we can be talking about, including race, and people shouldn't be penalized for making that their beat or their issue. Or, you know, most of the time we didn't even make it our issue. It was made for us, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, just
Sachi,
that.
last word?
I don't think for me it's so much about like the content, because I write how I feel like it, and that's it. And I work at a place that lets me do that, which is great. But I get a lot of what's the right word? Backlash? I hate that word too. Backlash.
Interesting feedback?
No,
Creative
nothing
feedback.
interesting about it.
Creative feedback.
I get a lot of garbage mail over tone. There's a lot of anxiety about tone, and I get this shit all the time. Where like, if I say something that like some white dude would say, he can get away with it. He can build a career off of it and breeze by easy. But if I say it, then it's like, I'm reverse racist, I'm a bitch, I'm gonna be hunted down. Like there's a whole thing around how you say something. So not only do black and brown people have to be careful about what they say, now we also have to be careful about how we say it. When like, I know I'm aggressive, I don't care, but everybody else seems to have a problem with it. But it's an easy tactic to sort of take away from the content by saying, well, I don't like how you said it. If you were nicer, I would have agreed with you. Like I got this a lot when I was working on, I wrote a lot about the Giangameshi trials, and I got a lot of people being like, well, like, you're kind of talking like I did it. And I'm like, I could give a shit if you feel bad about this. I'm really tired, and I have other things to worry about. And if your concern is that like the tone made you uncomfortable, then you didn't read it. And I can't help you then.
I think we're gonna stop it here. I think there.
He gets me. We're gonna go have a drink.
I think what we are going to notice, though, and It is very tough that we're going to, and voices here is that as you get the younger generation of journalists coming into newsrooms, they're going to be asking and wanting to do things very differently. We have different accesses to information. Social media plays a big role, Twitter, Reddit, Facebook, what have you. Who knows what's going to be out there, once these budding journalists sort of enter the newsroom, virtual newsroom, that is. So I think that we're going to constantly get to see that changing aspect within the newsrooms, but that conversation I think is going to continue to change, and maybe we will see a different wave. I'm going to now open up the floor to questions. I know there's a mic at the back of the room there. If you can give us your name and where you're from and who the question is directed to, or if it's directed to the panel. We've got about half hour. Yes, go ahead, sir.
This is not a question from a younger generation of journalists. My name is Michael Valpy. I teach media studies at University of Toronto. And I hope my question isn't going to be obvious, but when Hannah announced that the Globe and Mail was going to hire a race beat, or was going to have a race beat, I thought that all of you kind of nodded approvingly. So my question is, what do you expect a race beat reporter to report on, and what do you wish a race beat reporter will report on? And out of curiosity, what race is the race beat reporter?
So the person who will be doing the job has not been announced yet. There was a job posting that went up internally, and I thought it was great. What would you want to see from a race beat? I mean, if this is the question that's being asked of me, I'll just...
that it's going to be othering of some kind.
Okay.
Okay?
Yeah.
So go ahead.
Yeah, I know what you're asking, and at some point earlier I was talking about steps, and there are just so many steps towards getting to a place that is better, but it's never going to be perfect, right? And no step along the way is perfect. So I think I know what you're asking, and I think that in a perfect world there would not be a race beat. But obviously our world is very flawed, and I think that if we're going to talk about race properly, it's nice to know that there will be somebody who is dedicated to covering policy, news, profiles of interesting people. So, the way that anybody would treat any other beat, although race is unique, because I think it's very sensitive, and I think that everybody feels very attached to the idea of race, and very knowledgeable about it, even when people aren't actually. There's a lot of academic study out there. There's a lot of work being done in the issues of race, but like anybody who can write an online comment, I think feels like 100% like they know, what to say and everybody's talking rather than listening. So this is like really, sorry, rambly, but I just think in a perfect world, you're right, we wouldn't have a race beat, but I think it is great to have it because it is a step towards getting someplace better. And there are so many ways that a reporter could take that beat. And the Globe and Mail obviously isn't the first publication to have a reporter dedicated to that. So, there are examples of other people out there who are creating that beat as they do it, who are setting great examples. Mm-hmm.
I think also the question of what would the race of the reporter in the race beat be, I agree with Hannah. I think it's a step. I don't think that that's so much the important question. I think in a way it's a reflection of exactly where we are, that somebody needs to carve that out to justify the dollars to get it done. Because what I see happening is that where others are looking at what I'm doing and saying, you just put race into everything, I just think of it as an analysis, right? Somebody who does sports looks at the world and sees a lot of things that are happening in the world through the worlds of the sports that they're covering. I see it through the lens of race. And I think that's a completely legitimate way, and an important way, a critical way in Canada, of looking at the world. And I see that when we don't have your average reporter, your average newsroom focusing on that, what kind of things get lost? Things like the 2014 Toronto municipal election, where racism was rampant and in your face. You couldn't even hide it. Olivia Chow goes to meetings and candidate events where she's told to go back to China. Women who are running for office who are wearing hijab are being told to go back home, and their volunteers are being cussed out as they work. Signs are being vandalized. It seems that anytime the next racist thing happens in Toronto, we start pretending, oh my God, I can't believe that this is our city. Can't believe, well, what, did you not? But so it almost feels like we need this more dedicated way of talking about this, because we seem to, every time it happens, it's like the exception to the rule, and we're not treating it as though it's a systemic reality of our time. So although it might not be perfect, although you might not be able to find the perfect candidate to fit whatever you're supposed to think the diversity reporter is supposed to look like, the fact that we're acknowledging that this is a legitimate focus and an important focus of conversation is a step forward.
And I think to their point, I think what we mean is let's stop reporting on a knee-jerk reaction. Let's report on what is happening. I mean, I think all of us can probably tell you stories. I remember stories from when I was 5, and to me this is life. It's not a, oh my God, I can't believe this just happened. It's like, yeah, it happens every day. We just don't talk about it all the time.
I think there's also a ripple effect, like just because you have a justice reporter doesn't mean that other reporters can't report on legal issues or justice-related issues or stories. Just because you have an education reporter doesn't mean that, you know, other people can't write stories about things that are happening in the school systems. And so when you have a dedicated race reporter, I just think it's really cool as a signal to everyone else who's working in the newsroom, virtual or not, that race is a legitimate area of research and, you know, a legitimate topic that the Canadian public needs to be informed about and that they want to hear about as well. So,
Okay, let's go to the next question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Lisa Valencia Svensson. I'm a documentary producer. I produced a film called Migrant Dreams this past year, which was on TVO. It had a Hot Docs World premiere. We hired one of the top publicists in the city to cover it. And my question is based out of my example and my experience. My question is, how much are our top newsrooms really working hard to put people of color with anti-oppression analyses in the decision-making positions? Our publicist pitched the Toronto Star, and it's not, I'm going to name, not because they're the only ones, but because I think we need to get specific, pitched a story about migrant workers in Canada, many of whom are people of color, and many people of color are also poor. Class is a huge part of race, so that needs to be addressed as well. But anyway, our publicist pitched this story to a journalist very interested at the Toronto Star who happened to be a person of color. He pitched it internally. It was rejected 3 times as being not a story, an important enough story and a newsworthy enough story. And it was only until another person within the newsroom who happened to know us and happened to also be a person of color and happened to care a lot about these issues, put the pressure on inside that we finally got a top-level reporter with a separate camera photographer to come in and do a proper story. There are 500,000 temporary foreign workers in this country. How is this not a story of national interest? And I found myself thinking, if we had had people up there at the high levels, in this case at the Toronto Star, with a bit more of an analysis around what is the purpose of journalism in our society, and interested in and wanting to bring forward underrepresented stories about people of color, about race, about oppression, about exploitation, that story would have come out in April and May when our film was first premiering.
So is your question to the panelists?
To all of them.
Okay.
As you are working in the newsrooms, it was partly just to share the story and partly to ask you guys, you're seeing more people of color being brought in, hopefully with an anti-racist analysis and anti-oppression analysis, but are you seeing the top levels? Are we making progress fast enough to getting a diverse group of people making the key decisions about what stories get covered or not?
Okay, your thoughts?
To me, the short answer is absolutely not. We're not. There are not people, and that's exactly what I was trying to say before about the difference between diversity and anti-racism, anti-oppression in work. We are not in a place, I don't believe, where where I'm comfortable saying that important stories that are affecting marginalized people are going to be covered in the way, with the urgency particularly, that they need to. And one thing I've learned as a journalist is that we need, like I said before, we need numbers and data to do our jobs properly. And the places that numbers and data always exist in, like, or don't exist or are really hard to find or not being kept properly, it always has to do with marginalized communities. So we're hearing right now about dozens or hundreds of people crossing the border from the United States to try and claim refugee status here in Canada. Guys, I can tell you this because I talked to a reporter this week who wrote a story about this. If you ask the Canadian Border Service Agency and the RCMP, how many people are crossing over every day? How many are crossing over every month? How many are crossing over a year? They will tell you that they can't tell you. They are keeping numbers, but they don't want those numbers to be released to the public. And that phenomenon of people running across the border and risking their lives is primarily affecting African people, South and East Asian people, Middle Eastern people, people who don't speak always English as their first language, people who are going through a lot of difficulty right now. But the numbers aren't even there. And it's like our first job as journalists to be like, where are the numbers? Why aren't you even keeping numbers on this? Police killings in the city of Toronto. I know through excellent reporting, again, at Toronto Star by Wendy Gillis, that at least 35% of the people who have been shot and killed by your police in this city since 1990 have been black. Black men. At least 35%. And I'm saying at least because we weren't able to identify the race of all of them, so it could be higher. But the police and the Special Investigations Unit, which investigate these things, don't keep those statistics. So I think that if our profession was really interested in having justice for folks like that, they'd be screaming, banging down the doors of our government institutions being like, why don't you keep these numbers? How are we supposed to hold you accountable if you don't even track what you're doing? And we're not doing that. So we're allowing real problems involving marginalized people, often racialized people, to not get the coverage that they deserve. And there have been examples, again, I talk about police killings. Andrew Loku, a 45-year-old father of 5 who was shot and killed in 2015 by the Toronto police. The Star went to bat real hard for Andrew Loku and about his story and making sure that the report into his investigation became the first report in the history of the Special Investigations Unit to be publicized. And that's what I'm talking about, because for 26 years, the Special Investigations Unit in Ontario has somehow investigated thousands of incidents with police and never published one to the public.
So are you saying because we may not have those stats, numbers are sort of that grabber, that pitch grabber to say, hey, we're looking at 35% here, we're looking at 50% here, we're looking at, hundreds of people trying to come across the border, 50% of those get detained, et cetera. Is it because we don't have those stats and when we're going to now our producers and managers and whatnot and saying, here's a really big story that we should be covering.
Yeah.
I'm hearing this is a big issue. I'm speaking to, a doc maker who's spoken to these people, et cetera, but because I may not have some of the hard facts, my story could be falling short?
Well, I'm saying that editor and that decision maker should understand by now, doing the job that they've been doing for decades, I would imagine, that you don't have numbers about things that people don't care about. And that just like the Toronto Star said, we demand to see this report of this black man who was killed by the police, we should be doing that all the time. Like it was a really big campaign and it got results. But that should be more of our focus all the time, is looking into the places where information is being hidden, where information is not available for us, and demanding that we have access to that. It's kind of a primary role.
Do you guys have anything to add
Yeah,
to the question?
if I could just jump in on that. I sit close to Robin Doolittle at the Globe and Mail, and she just she did an investigation that took almost 2 years of basically, speaking to Desmond's point about statistics and a lack of data. Her story was about unfounded statistics, so it's basically about a sexual assault, criminal kind of categorization when it comes to policing. It's called unfounded, and it essentially means that, we do not believe a crime occurred. So this is a stat that Statistics Canada stopped basically keeping. And so what Robin had to do, and what decision makers at the Globe decided to do, was to go into a very long and expensive process of collating the data themselves. So they went to all the police jurisdictions across the country, and it's like very complicated because different police forces, and it's like different boundaries, and it's like just a lot of data. And so yes, decision makers at the top had to say, this is worthwhile to us to have a reporter and a team of data journalists on this for almost 2 years. And to file all these FOIs, it's extremely expensive in a business that is, well, you know how the business side of things is going. So you're right, Lisa. Well, I can't see you because I can't see anybody because it's blinding up here. But you're right that it's about people at the top making those decisions, because there are definitely reporters interested in the issue of migrant workers and how, you know, the lives of migrant workers, the families that they're raising here on Canadian soil, and, you know, with no pathway towards becoming actually Canadian, and you know, their hands touch pretty much everything that we touch as Canadian citizens. Like, this is a real issue for Canadians that gets to the heart of like how we see ourselves and what it means to be Canadian. But yeah, it takes somebody at the top to say, because there are reporters who are interested, it takes somebody at the top to say, we're going to spend all this money and time on it. And I just think it's unfortunate that obviously there isn't all the money there is to go around. And I think that also what I've seen is that change is really slow, but you keep like pushing, and it's inevitable. Like I'm very optimistic about change happening. I just don't know how fast it's happening.
All right, thank you for that question. Next question.
Hi, I'm Lauren Strapgell. I'm the managing editor for Canada at BuzzFeed. So Corsaggi. Hi. My question is for Desmond. It's really for everybody whoever wants to jump in. But I love when you're talking about how it should be anti-oppression, not diversity, because that's a big difference. But it seems to be that most newsrooms, especially the ones I've been in, that's language they can't even wrap their heads around. Like, they're barely managing to figure out what diversity means to them, as meaningless as it is anyway. And I wonder if part of it is that maybe newsrooms are so unwilling to examine how their content contributes to systems of oppression. But I'm wondering, why is it that we haven't moved on to that kind of language, and what would it take to get there?
Fix it.
The reason that this is so hard, as I mentioned earlier, I think, is because it's about power. Because when you in the newsroom are making the decisions about things like, are we covering this fairly? And you're a white, middle-aged or older guy who's been doing this for a long time and didn't grow up in the era where we had these conversations. When we start talking to you about it, what I see over and over again is a resentment and a fear of losing control. And I don't know how to deal with that except to try and stay working in this industry until such time that myself and other people can take charge. Guys, I went to the Ontario Public Service yesterday. This is something that I'd like to write about. There is rampant anti-black racism within the Ontario Public Service, and I can't tell you how many black employees have been talking to me and calling me and saying, I brought up an incident of racism at work and I got suspended like I was the problem. I'm hearing this on a regular basis. The head of the Ontario Public Service was at the Black History Month event that I was at yesterday. He was asked 3 times, if you find that you have managers that are doing this to us, because we know that they are, will you commit to firing them? He would not say yes. He would not say yes. This is the head of the Ontario Public Service who did a survey. He talked about his own survey, and his surveys, to talk about numbers, said that about 1/4 of the black employees reported having a discriminatory event in the last 2 years of work. That's huge. So all they're saying is, will you start removing people who keep doing this to us? he would not say yes. That guy is afraid. You know what he actually responded a lot of the time when he was being asked?
What was his answer?
His response was, we have to make sure that any process would be fair. Why are you worried that disciplining people who are discriminating in your workplace won't be fair? Everybody has HR practices. Everybody's supposed to have consequences already for inappropriate conduct at work. And I don't hear anybody saying, well, I'd like to develop an HR policy, but what if it's unfair? You just do it because it's required. But when it comes to giving black people in this case the justice that they deserve, oh, but what if it's an unfair process? In other words, what if a white person gets unfairly disciplined for false allegations of racism? I can't help that man. And he makes $325,000 a year and is the head of the Ontario Public Service. I can't help him. But one day he's going to be gone. And we have to hope that we can move other people with a different philosophy and a different mentality into his position, because it's deeply, deeply affecting the quality of our public services, and it's something I would like to write about.
Anyone else want to add to that? Okay, well, I think any other questions? All right, well, thank you all for coming. We really appreciate this. And of course, thank you to our 4 panelists who I appreciate your openness and honesty. This is why we brought you here, because we really wanted to hear your thoughts, and I'm hoping that a lot of you are going to go home with more thoughts and continue the conversation. Over to Kathy English now.
Hi, everyone. Yes, my name's Kathy English. I'm the program and co-chair of the Canadian Journalism Foundation and the public editor of the Toronto Star. As you may have gathered, my office is often at the center of reader concerns and complaints about a lot of these issues that really matter deeply to our community, and we really need to figure them out. I know we're not there yet. The Star long ago, back in the years when they were talking about multiculturalism and visible minorities, defined the goal as equal dignity for all. We're not there yet, and we need to keep working. Most of all, we have to keep listening. And so on behalf of the CJF, I want to thank our panel. And also, Angie, thank you for leading a discussion that brought a great conversation to all of us. So please, one more round of applause for our panel and our speakers. Getting us, okay. Yes, I also want to invite you to our next J Talk on March 7th. In the lead up to International Women's Day, we're going to look at harassment of women in media. Sachi, could you join us for that one too, please?
So much
We're going to look at all the garbage that women are facing online and some of the possible solutions, if any. As well, our awards program is now in its last week with awards, fellowships for early and mid-career journalists. We have an award for Indigenous journalism talent, a new investigative journalism internship with the Globe and Mail, and awards celebrating journalistic excellence and lifetime achievement. So take a look at our website. There's still time for submissions, and our Twitter feed has details as well. Finally, our thanks to TD for hosting tonight and for leading this really critical conversation on diversity and inclusion, and for walking the talk in a way that news organizations are not yet doing. I want to invite you all now to have a drink, talk with our panels, and let's keep this conversation going. Thank you.